In 2014, Colorado became the first state to legalize cannabis for non-medical use. In 2018, Canada legalized it nationwide. Over the past decade, more and more states have adopted similar legalizations. As of 2025, 24 states in the District of Columbia have legalized cannabis for non-medical use, and a further 15 have legalized it for medical use only. In the United States, the legal sales were estimated at $38 billion in 2020-4. This number is to grow over the coming years as more states pursue legalization. The large size of the market unsurprisingly piqued the interest of big business. Since legalization began, dozens of new cannabis companies have gone public on US and Canadian stock exchanges. Everybody wants to get a piece of the new legalized market. In 2018, the alcohol giant Constellation Brands paid $4 billion to acquire minority stake in the Canadian cannabis company Cannabis Growth. Over the past decade, the legal market has indeed grown much as expected. But this has not resulted in the large profits many investors had hoped for. In 2017, the Global X Marijuana Life Sciences ETF was launched on the Toronto Stock Exchange at an initial trading price of $42. At the peak of the legalization hype in 2018, it reached as high as $100. Now it sits at just $6.59, an 85% decline since inception. The majority of its constituent companies are losing money. And remember that in 2018, Mode parent company Constellation Brands made a $4 billion bet on the industry with its investment in Canopy Growth. This investment has been a near total loss, with Canopy Growth's share price having fallen more than 99%. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the legal cannabis market and why, despite its large size, it seems almost impossible to turn a profit. While the regulations vary by state, the legal cannabis industry generally develops as follows. Once cannabis is legalized, the state government issuing licenses to private companies. Typically, the state issues 3 types of licenses. A cultivation license, which is required to grow the plant. A processing license, which is required to process the raw plant to finished products such as vapes or edible products. A retail dispensary license, which is required to sell the product to end consumers. Large cannabis companies may be vertically integrated, getting licenses to grow, process, and sell their own product. Smaller independent dispensaries may decide to source their product from third-party processors. Although in some states, vertical integration is required. Every state that legalizes cannabis charges excise taxes on its sale. The tax rates vary by state but are generally around 15%. The difficulty of opening up a new marijuana business varies significantly state by state. The most difficult state is Florida, where only medical marijuana is currently legal. Florida requires medical dispensaries to be vertically integrated and that they must grow and process their own product themselves. The cost is so with obtaining a license are immense. You need to pay an application fee of $146,000. If approved, you need to pay another fee of $1. $2 million. And you have to prove that you have $5 million of liquid assets to fund your operations. So if you want to start a medical dispensary in Florida, you'll need upwards of $7 million. This is clearly out of reach for any mom and pop operator. So in Florida, substantially all dispensaries are owned by large companies backed by large investors. On the other of the spectrum, we have Oregon, which has perhaps the most liberal application process for starting a new marijuana business. If you want to grow cannabis, you need to pay a fee of $1.000 to $6.000 per year based on how much you grow. Process marijuana, you need to pay a license fee of $5,000 per year. And to operate a retail dispensary, you need to pay a license fee of approximately $5,000 per year. Oregon does not require cannabis retailers to be vertically integrated. So if you want to start your own dispensary, you only need to pay $5,000 per year. The low cost of obtaining a license has resulted in the proliferation of independent family-owned dispensaries and grow operations across the state. It is generally not allowed to transport cannabis across state lines. It must be grown and processed in the state where it is sold. Differing regulations and taxes can result in varied consumer prices across different states. In states such as Alaska, which does not have a suitable climate for the cultivation of marijuana, it must be grown inside climate-controlled facilities. There's certainly a lot of demand for the product. In 2020-4, total legal cannabis sales in Canada are estimated at about $3 billion, while legal sales in the US were $38 billion. Despite this, most publicly traded cannabis companies have struggled to generate profits. Let's compare the profitability of cannabis companies with alcohol and tobacco. The largest alcohol company in the US is UB & Bev, the parent company of Budweiser. 20-4, they generated $60 billion of revenue and reported operating profit of $15 billion or 25% of revenue. Altria, the company that sells Marlboro cigarettes in the US, generated $24 billion of revenue. They reported an operating profit of $11 billion or 46% of revenue. The largest publicly traded cannabis company is Cure Relief, which operates in both Canada and the US. 2020-4, they generated $1.3 billion of revenue. They barely broke even, reporting an operating profit of $20 million or than 2% of revenue. This minuscule operating profit wasn't even enough to cover their interest expense, so they reported a net loss. And Cure Leaf is actually doing better than most. Most publicly traded cannabis companies are losing money. Remember that in 2018 the alcohol giant Constellation Brands made a $4 billion investment in a cannabis company called Cannabis Growth. Constellation Brands is the maker of Modelo Beer, Corona Beer and others. They believe that with their deep pockets and marketing expertise they could turn Growth into a leader in the rapidly growing legal cannabis market. In this objective, they failed completely. Since Constellation made this investment, Canopy Growth has incurred huge losses and appears to be on the brink of bankruptcy. So why is marijuana so much less profitable than alcohol or tobacco? Large alcohol brands spend billions of dollars on advertising. This creates brand loyalty such that consumers are willing to pay a premium for brands that they know and trust. Imagine you walk into a grocery store and you want to buy a 6-pack of beers. A 6-pack of Corona costs $10. A beer you've never heard of only cost $8. People are willing to pay the extra $2 for the name brand. In both Canada and the United States, advertising of cannabis is effectively banned. You can't show commercials on television, radio, internet, or any other medium. This makes it almost impossible to establish brand loyalty. Different producers can compete only on price and the level of THC. Many consumers will just purchase whichever brand gives most THC per dollar. But what about tobacco? Cigarette advertising has been banned since the late 1990s. Yet Altria, the parent company of Marlboro, makes massive profit margins even higher than most alcohol brands. How is this possible? Marlboro establishes brand identity back in the day when they are allowed to advertise. Now everybody knows Marlboro, even non-smokers. If for whatever reason you decide to start smoking for the first time, you walk into the gas station to buy a pack of cigarettes. A pretty good chance you choose a Marlboro just because that's the only brand you've heard of, even if it's a little bit more expensive. Also, cigarettes are mostly sold at gas stations and convenience stores. They have limited shelf space behind the counter, so you typically only stock a handful of nationally recognized brands. Established alcohol brands need to spend billions of dollars per year on advertising just to maintain their market share. Otherwise, they risk losing share to up-and-coming brands. So, while they make large gross profit margins, a lot of this needs to be reinvested back into marketing. Ironically, the advertising ban is a huge windfall for Altria. Their dominant brands are completely protected from competition. Any up-and-coming new cigarette brand will need to run an advertising campaign to get their name on the map, but this is banned. So, Altria can continue reaping monopoly profits without spending a penny on advertising. In the case of cannabis brands, they never had a chance to do any advertising in the first place. You walk into a dispensary for the first time, you'll see many different brands available, but these brands mean nothing to you because you've never heard of any of them. So you'll probably just buy whichever is the cheapest. And cannabis is only allowed to be sold at dedicated dispensaries. They have enough room to house dozens of different brands, making competition even more fierce. The competition is especially fierce in areas where licenses are easy to obtain. Earlier in the video, we talked about how it's extremely easy to get a cannabis selling license in Oregon. Oregon legalized recreational cannabis in 2015. By 2018, so many growers had the market that the state was producing twice as much product as it could consume, and they weren't allowed to export this excess to other states. So they had no choice but to lower their prices in an attempt to increase consumption within Oregon. As of 2025, prices are still extremely low. According to Axios, the median retail price per gram of flower is just $3.75. To get a sense of how cheap that is, an average marijuana user consumes 1.35 grams in a day. This is according to the National Institutes of Health in Oregon, that will only cost you $5 a day, which is much cheaper than alcohol or tobacco. While that's great for consumers, it's far too little to cover the cost of growing, processing, and retailing. And they still have excess inventory. We can probably expect to see a large wave of bankruptcies from growers in Oregon over the coming years. While Oregon is an extreme example, in most states, prices are so low that producers struggle to break even. A similar situation exists in Canada. Immediately following legalization in 2018, there was a massive amount of investor hype. This allowed numerous cannabis companies to list their shares on stock exchanges and raise hundreds of millions of dollars from investors. They used this money to fund the construction of massive indoor growth facilities. These growth facilities have significant fixed costs, so it's more efficient to run them at max capacity. This created a situation of oversupply and plummeting retail prices. Instead of analyzing each company individually, it's easier to just look at the cannabis ETF. It contains a wide of cannabis companies that operate in both Canada and the US. Almost all of its constituent companies are losing money, and the ETF has lost 85% of its value since inception. When cannabis was first legalized, investors hoped this new industry would create the next Marlboro or Budweiser. However, the low barriers to entry and inabilities advertised makes it impossible for a dominant cannabis brand to be created. The industry is here to stay and will even continue to grow as more states vote to legalize. Despite this, the market is likely to remain fragmented, with thousands of independent producers competing fiercely and at best making razor-thin margins. Alright guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about the legal cannabis market? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.